Hello, and welcome back to Unstratified Entertainment. This is the series where Andy and I get to indulge in one of our great passions, and that is discussing the nuts and bolts of the media that surrounds history and heritage and archaeology, and the way in which it can be used to inform, to delight, and in some cases even enrage you as a viewer. Certainly, not that long.
Hang on, Mark, just a second.
Uh-huh.
You talking about how heritage and archaeology are used in the media to, inform, educate, and entertain, in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
immortal words of the BBC. In which case, why are we talking about Noah 2014, directed by Darren Aronofsky, which has precious little to do with heritage or archaeology?
That's a good question. And just to be clear, folks at home, I'm not suggesting that this is a literal historical story, but it is fascinating from a couple of different perspectives. First of all, there is the fact that it is a story that so many of us, especially in the Western world, are familiar with. You know, from childhood, you hear that the animals went in two by two, hurrah, hurrah. The Noah story. It is part of the Bible, and indeed has its roots possibly in older literature. But I think what's happening here in this film is a fascinating combination of this sort of cultural touchstone, a sort of an operatic reference point that we can all have a sense of what's happening. But also as well, the director Darren Aronofsky is actually an anthropologist. He majored in cultural anthropology at university, and I think you can see some of that in the film, and it certainly raises questions knowing that as I'm watching it, as to why he made certain decisions as to, for the look of the story, for the portrayal of the people in this story, and also as well the portrayal of a really deep, it's implied, really deep time history for humanity. But
Can
we'll
I
come back
point
to
can
that.
I point out here as well? Yeah, I was going to say, can I point out as well
Hmm.
that I think he or certainly his designers and his production team and his CGI designers have played a lot of computer games like Morrowind, and so because for me, it has the look of one of these massive open world
Uh huh.
computer
Uh huh.
games which you can explore, the grungy look and everything else. We'll come to all this in a minute, but
Yeah.
yeah, no, you look, it's a fascinating discussion, but I'm not sure. We'll see how close we can get to actual history and archaeology and heritage when as we talk, I think.
Okay. Okay. Well, I find it interesting. Uh, if you want to start with a talking point on that along those lines, I find it really interesting that this film, as you say, takes part in this sort of takes place in this sort of Mordor slash Mad Max slash
Mm.
Fallout kind of universe. But also, we see from space that Earth is in its sort of Pangean form, a time before the continents drifted apart. The sky, even in the daytime, is replete with stars and galaxies, implying that the universe is much smaller, much younger, and we can see these things on this planet. Whereas now, obviously, they're much further away, so many years later. Now, this is ahistorical. Humanity was not around when Earth was Pangea, but I found it actually quite beautiful that this it was portraying an alien Earth, and in so many ways, I think that our actual real past is in fact more alien than we like to think. Indeed, just this afternoon, I retweeted a bit of research or a call for research from a Twitter account called Roman Scotland, where they're highlighting basically a bias about how we think the Roman world reacted to Britain and interacted with Scotland. The fact that there are 150 sites north of the Scottish border that are likely Roman really shows how actually that world is not understood, even though we map our modern biases onto it. There's a bias basically because people think, well, Roman sites are in England and Scotland was never conquered, or this kind of thing. It's a very simplistic view, but it's a mythology that that we've crafted that feels familiar, feels safer, and feels more relatable than what actually happened. And what actually happened was much more complicated and much more alien in that sense. So I think setting this movie in the context that they have, it feels kind of dreamlike, I suppose.
Where you
No?
start? No, look, I, 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 I'm looking at the poster for
Yeah.
the film now, and it's this sort of we've got Noah in capitals across the bottom.
Hmm.
The image is a sort of Russell Crowe at his most sort of rock hewn, I suppose.
Yeah,
And we've
he's
got
definitely
Jennifer
got
Connelly.
he's got a shoulder and a back in this one, hasn't he? He's rugby
Absolutely.
ready. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I am Noah, builder of arks, carrier of animals. Uh,
And I will have my vengeance. Yeah.
yeah, but the, but looking at it and then thinking of the film, the only reason it's called Noah is to tie into the audience that recognizes Noah as an archetypal story from Western Judeo-Christian society,
Yeah.
civilization, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
Um, you could call it Flood, and it would be the same movie. You
Yes.
could call it Cataclysm, and it would be the same movie.
Yeah.
You know, um, so I think the question arises, why make it at all? Why? And it's interesting, and we'll perhaps come on to the history of epic movies and biblical epics in particular,
Mm.
and Noah in as portrayed in cinema as we talk. But um, I I I have to say, when and I watched it on a streaming service, it's on the
Hmm.
streaming services now. So I could, stop it and go back and look at bits again and have another look. And I, the biggest question I had really at the end of it was why, and what, in particular, why that way?
Well, my understanding is that the director um, comes from a Jewish background, who's brought up Jewish
Hmm.
in New York, I
Yeah.
think. And again, my understanding, this may not be the case now, but at the time, interviews were stating that he was not practicing, but that he had a sort of nostalgia for those stories and for religious belief and for the way in which it frames how you view the world around you. And again, this I think is thinking that comes out of possibly that anthropological university background. Yeah, recontextualizing what maybe you believed as a child to be, you know, just this is the truth, this is the past, and sort of coming to some decisions as to some of the realities of what if it happened, it must have been like. And I think that's where some of the value for this comes from, because actually, as much as it's a film that is based in a religious what became a religious story, I think it's also examining human nature, our relationship with the planet, and it's asking questions about stewardship and discernment, I suppose. The ability to take responsibility for your actions as a individual, but also I suppose as a species. One of the things I recently watched this were actually with a couple of people um, who are Christian. They go to church very regularly, and I kind of looked at them and said, "What do you think of this?" And they said, "Well, yeah, I struggle with Noah." They say because it implies a really gross mistake made by an infallible God, and also as well, one of them is a GP, and they said, and to be fair, humanity's got a really grim bottleneck when it comes to genetics. Yeah. And I was like, yeah, yeah, no, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
um, and so, I don't think necessarily you are necessarily being asked to take this uh, as a cornerstone of your faith if you are a person of faith. but it certainly is asking questions about what it means to be and to exist on a planet that is filled with other life forms and how we relate to them and to each other. I mean, did you get any of that sort of a sense of a sort of almost, I guess, an environmental perspective from this film?
Yes and no. I mean, for me, the that environmental perspective, I can see why it's argued, and I can see why people have seen it. The idea of humanity is messing up the planet, and it needs to be cleansed. Well, it's a pretty drastic way for put it this way, particularly if you're coming from a secular point of view, which I
Hmm.
am.
Hmm.
Obviously, my culture is a Judeo-Christian one, but it's not, practicing any faith,
Hmm.
and so it's and yes, one is aware, for example, of extreme members of the eco movement who do talk about depopulation as the only way to save the planet and so
Well, there is, yeah, there is
on.
a couple of movements, I think, where it's almost a case of voluntarily shrinking humanity. Yeah,
Yeah,
asking people
yeah,
not to have
yeah,
kids. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
So it it has relevance, but for me, it fell in between not two stools, but several.
Hmm.
Um, because the central to the movie is a completely factitious confrontation between Russell Crowe as Noah and Ray Winston as a character called Tubal Cain, who's a descendant of Cain, the figure who's condemned for the murder of his brother Abel
Hmm.
in Genesis,
Hmm.
and and that continues. Uh, you know, yeah, just when you think he's been swept away with all the other bad guys and bad humans in the flood,
Hmm.
he actually, he snuck his way onto the ark, and there's this whole sort of Die Hard Air Force One confrontation between the two of them to sustain some kind of action while they're actually floating around for 40 days and 40 nights
Hmm.
after the flood. It's a really clunky for me piece of concocted plot. Um, at the same time, I can understand why they did it, because if you look at the source material, I'm just looking at Genesis. I'm not looking at the other source material like the Epic of Gilgamesh or all the other world flood myths.
Hmm.
Um, but you know, in Genesis, it's only about 3 or 4 chapters. I think it's a very short account.
Yeah.
And okay, a screenwriter can turn a sentence into a screenplay,
Hmm.
but it's it's stretched pretty thin, I think.
It is stretched thin, and from what I remember as a kid of the Noah story, it was a case of being quite serene, really. Everyone
Mm,
goes on board, gets wet
yeah.
outside. I kind of imagined that people just went, oh, when it started to rain and could have walked off and then, exit
Mm,
stage left. They were never seen again. I never really thought about what it would be like to hear people, for example, outside your ark, drowning.
mm,
Which again, I think is an interesting part of this film, but we'll come back to that in a sec.
yeah.
But then
Yeah.
also as well, yeah, you just imagine that, yeah, people just were like quite, ha, 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 happy and maybe praying or whatever, or just passing the time, and
Mm,
then they send out a dove and it comes back with an olive branch. It was this film really is about that middle bit. It's about, for the most part, the drama that they've imagined unfolding on the arc, uh, and again, if we don't take this as a literal telling of history, I find it really interesting as a so Agatha Christie would do something similar with closed situations for murder to unfold, wouldn't she? An island or a manor
mm.
house or something that's been
Yeah.
cut off by weather events.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing, and it focuses and I think magnifies at the same time the impact of human relations, human interpersonal conflict, and in this
Mm,
case, it's what becomes basically a death cult for a little bit on board when Crow, or sorry,
mm.
Noah,
Yeah.
um, decides that his mission is to oversee the reawakening of the animals. They've sort of put them to sleep with some sort of incense, and then to let humanity die out in the natural course of things. Um, and but also as well, you have that psychological context that's, I think, very well portrayed, that if it was happening in an Agatha Christie sort of conceit, here are all of our main players and they're all on this boat. Outside the boat, they hear the rest of humanity dying. There's a really painterly moment where the cinematography frames a mountaintop and waves crashing onto it, and human flesh, bodies just flying up in the air with the force of nature. I think as an invitation to think about what would you feel in that situation. I think it works as an experience. And then, of course, there's the most, for my money, one of the most beautiful depictions of the evolution of the universe I've ever seen, when Noah tells, using the words from the Bible, but with visuals from obviously modern cinematography, time lapse progression of a universe that starts with.
So why didn't Darren Aronofsky cast Professor Brian Cox?
Well, because I think what we have here is a human story. I mean, I know you're being devil's advocate here because I know you love human stories, but I think
Yes.
I think what you have is, as you say, there's any number of founding myths across the world, and in this instance, you see a scientific progression of the Big Bang, the coalescence of material, gravity, light, all this stuff interacting. Eventually, out of that comes the beginnings of cellular life, and then so on and so forth. And it very cleverly skips over the last bit. I don't know if you noticed this, but you have this sort of progression of life using this sort of stop motion photography going through a landscape. Eventually, you have sort of simians and apes and primates possibly swinging through the trees, and then there's like a flash.
I half expect them to throw a bone in the air and it turns into a spaceship.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, it's a little bit Kubrickian, but then it flashes to white, and then you get suddenly two humans walking in the garden, quote unquote. So I think it walks a line that's trying to be as accessible to as many minds as possible. I think I know people have watched this and liked it from a religious perspective, but other people have enjoyed it despite having no faith at all. And I think it's quite clever in that sense.
It's clearly, it's clearly trying very hard not to be one of those films that has come out in the States in the last 10, 15, 20 years, which is aimed specifically at the Bible Belt fundamentalist Christian, whatever. Because, anybody turning up to see a film called Noah expecting a literal retelling of, literally chapter and verse of the book of Genesis is not going to get it with this film.
No.
It's trying very hard to be there for a religious audience, but also a secular audience. The imagery it uses is not the traditional. I'll talk about the imagery in biblical films or Bible-based films perhaps in a bit, but it's trying. Yeah, but yes, as opposed to Kubrick or anything else. I don't want to knock it for trying to tell a big story. And one of the biggest stories is sort of where we come from and where we're going. And so the environmental spin and so on, again, I think it's entirely understandable given when it was made in the early 2010s. It's just that I find by trying to be all things to all people, it just ends up as a CGI fest. It has some very strong actors in it. We've talked about Russell Crowe and we've talked about Ray Winstone, but you've got Jennifer Connelly, actually in probably one of the more interesting roles, playing Nahmeh, who's Noah's wife. Is she actually named? I don't think she's actually named in Genesis, is she? I can't remember.
I'm not sure.
No.
Maybe I should have read it before we started recording.
That's all right. So me too. But no, I mean, Emma Watson. Anthony Hopkins does a wonderful sort of old man turn as Methuselah,
Yeah.
and so on. Among the voice artists, you got Frank Langella, Nick Nolte.
Mm.
Um, it's a considerable piece of work, and it was, it's expensive. It was a major name director. I think it's quite interesting. He previously tackled a story set on a boat which deals with big philosophical issues with Life of Pi.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Well, and he went on to do Mother with Jennifer Connelly, which is a
indeed,
story about the earth and God and humanity, actually, broadly speaking.
yeah. So
Yeah.
he's not afraid to tackle big issues,
No.
and all credit for filmmakers that can do that.
Mm.
It makes a distinct, and pleasant change from yet another movie about a vigilante, or it's or another CGI fest from the Marvel universe, or
Well,
um,
and yet, though, as you say, it is CGI heavy. The
hmm,
Nephilim, the fallen angels who came to Earth to
yeah,
help the kin of Cain and ended up in this instance helping Noah. Are fascinating. I think they're again for this story that they're telling. They're beautifully rendered as these beings of light encrusted in the,
hmm.
the grimness of the world that they find themselves in, literally in the earth itself. And the,
Except that I felt they wandered in from the next sequel to 300. You know,
yes, yeah, no, I agree, and so, but yeah, suddenly, and this is where I think my point about the dreamscape or the sort of
Hmm,
the weird young Earth that's being portrayed. Suddenly, you feel as though maybe it's an episode of Star Trek or something, or it's yeah, you've got
hmm.
these creatures. But then again, there are an awful lot of people who do unfortunately hang an element of their faith on the role that these creatures played, apparently biblically. I think they're
Hmm.
mentioned here and there in the Bible,
Yeah.
but certainly as an archaeologist running a Facebook page, the sheer number of photoshopped fakery out there, where you have either tiny little people photoshopped onto a normal size skeleton to make it look like they're excavating a giant, or the other way round, a giant skeleton photoshopped behind normal sized people. It's quite depressing because it's people reaching to prove that aspect of the Bible because it's so important to them. So I think the reason why these creatures
Hmm.
turn up is partly because they're visually interesting. They have that sort of Ent-like quality, Lord of the Rings ishness, I guess.
Yeah.
But then also as well, they are in fact. I think Aronofsky and his writing team drew on as much as possible out of Genesis and those stories to create an interesting world for this to take part in. I mean, just very briefly. I mean, for example, one of the most interesting lines from Ray Winston is I'm not afraid of
Ray Winston.
yeah, yeah, Ray Winston as Beowulf. The sea is my mother.
Yeah.
No. He says, I'm not afraid of miracles, Noah. That kind of thing. And this is a little bit like, for example, when you play Dungeons and Dragons, where for the people in that game or in this movie,
Hmm,
the question of whether or not there is a creator or gods in D&D is not a question. They just are. They accept
hmm,
it, and Ray Winston is and his interaction with the idea of miracles as being dangerous or threatening or somehow something because it's clear that his character wants to be able to relate to the creator on his own terms, but is being ignored because
hmm.
of his hubris. Um, but I think that's part of the again part of the setting for this story. It is a psychodrama basically, with all of this stuff to keep you visually entertained and bring you along for the ride. Um, I think it speaks to different ways of being human, and I think
Hmm.
it does it relatively well.
Okay, I can understand you coming at it from that point of view. I
Mm,
mean, again, I can't help but come at it from um, a mythological point of view, a writing point of view, not necessarily a historical point of view. Actually, I think it's more. This is. a movie perhaps to look at more culturally than
Well,
historically.
possibly. Although I'll bring us back
Uh,
to some physical evidence in a moment. But go ahead.
okay,
Yeah.
but no, but you know, you've just explained elements that have had to be put together like Jenga blocks to make the film work over the couple of hours running time.
Yeah.
You know, because in the original story, you know, God gets cross with people.
Hmm.
God tips off Noah that he's cross with people and that he's going to get rid of the people. Noah builds ark, loads animals.
Yeah.
God carries out his threat.
Hmm.
Ark floats around for 40 days until Dove comes back with branch. Ark settles on Mount Ararat. Everybody disembarks and humanity lives happily ever after.
Oh, and Noah gets
Well,
drunk.
and Noah gets, yeah, you know, it's a very simple
Mm.
um, parable of good, evil, um, the possibility of regeneration and forgiveness.
Mm. Mm.
And that's it.
So, do you think that's one of the potential weaknesses of this as a format for exploring human nature, in so much as it's such a well-known tale that we know the end points? Basically, we know the checkpoints and the milestones, and really they're having to find spaces between the words and between the lines in order to tell us a story that they want to tell as well. I mean, if this had been set in space and people were leaving a dying planet in a sci-fi kind of way, they might have been much
Mm.
freer to tell that tale.
I think that's a really interesting point. One of the things that came to mind while I was watching it
Hmm.
was, and again, I know it's been heavily criticized as where you know, from people who love the series, but Ridley Scott's Prometheus, the prequel to Alien,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
which even some of the visuals are very similar. It's sort of
Hmm.
rocky landscapes. I mean, I can't remember where Prometheus was shot.
Iceland, I think.
The sequence, exactly, and
Hmm.
so were the end sequences of Noah shot in Iceland.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Hmm.
it's the it's almost a primeval version of King Lear's blasted heath with the, you know,
Hmm.
the grass and the rocks but no trees, and
Hmm.
you know the idea it's something that's green but also hard.
Hmm. Hmm.
um and and you know, it could go either way. It could become greener, or it could become just another desolate landscape. Also, elements, parts of you know, again, it was Iceland. The visualization of the landscape of the north in
Hmm.
Game of Thrones.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, you know, okay. Yeah, when this was filmed in 2014, Game of Thrones wasn't, you know, a thing to that. I can't remember when the first series was, but you know, it certainly wasn't a reference that you'd make
Yeah.
if you watched it when the film was first released.
Hmm. Hmm.
And but yeah, it's I I keep on coming back to the idea that if you, it's absolutely fine to explore all those ideas, but to sort of shoehorn them into a few chapters of the Book of Genesis because people recognize the title and might be more tempted to go and see the movie, you might be cynically, you know, arguing.
Hmm.
Um, I'm just not, apart from thinking it looked like a, you know, an open world computer game like Morrowind, you know, the Elder Scrolls, that kind of big open world epic
Hmm.
movie.
Hmm.
Um, what I kept on thinking, basically, why? What,
Hmm.
you know, what's this? Why is it taking this particular subject matter and then treating it in this particular way, which just seemed, as I say, affected, you know.
Well, you say affected. I seem to recall at the time there was some news stories surrounding the fact that Russell Crowe had claimed to have gotten, I think then Pope France, Pope uh,
Benedict.
Benedict. That's it. Yes, Benedict's blessing for the film, you know, i.e., that it wasn't anti-Catholic.
Mm,
Um, so maybe there is an element or an aspect of it being a genre that people will go and see. Um,
mm,
but also, I mean, I asked myself similar questions from a sort of why standpoint, you know, why perspective, when it came to the decisions around the portrayal of technology and also
mm,
humanity. So, for example, everyone in this film is white.
Yes.
There's no one from the Middle East, even.
Yes.
There's certainly no one from Africa.
Yeah.
The other thing is that everyone in this film wears clothes that are woven, mechanically woven, as opposed to knitted or even using stitching together pieces of leather and skin and this kind of thing. They make the choice to make Noah's family, who is very much in the minority, and hence he's chosen to be given this message about the ark and the need for the ark, as being basically vegan. And there's no problem with being vegan, but
No.
certainly at that time you didn't have the choice to be vegan, especially in that landscape, which they portray
Yeah.
as being almost lunar in terms of the scarcity of vegetable life and animal life.
Yeah.
And there's an implication that the animals have been overhunted by mankind, who also as well have developed steel like metallurgy. They have welding masks, which are crudely, they have stuff stuck on them to make them look like they're not welding masks, but they basically got a shape of a commercial welding mask. In terms of the blacksmithery, but also as well things like knives are shaped like a modern hunting knife, with a serrated edge along the back, a long, straight, thin blade for almost tactical reasons.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. You could.
Oh, and ceramics. There are ceramics in here as well.
Yeah, but you see, for is it what's? And I think that's where it's. You could argue it's either very clever or horribly mixed up in the references it's using, because you could you've talked about this film being set in a post-Pangea but distant past, young planet type of thing.
Millions of years ago.
You could just as easily see it. Yeah, you could just as easily see it as as you sort of alluded to earlier, a post-apocalyptic Mad Max. Humankind trying it on again. I agree with you about about the non-diverse nature of the visual of humanity, as it's shown in this. And the other thing as well is I kept on getting hints of, I was thinking that there are certain parts of Graham Hancock's audience that will absolutely love this. It was playing with some of those sort of tropes.
Well, he loves the word cataclysm, as we've established previously.
Exactly. You're half expecting Noah and the Younger Dryas.
Yeah.
It's that's his next book.
Yeah.
It's
actually, no. I mean, in all seriousness, he does make an awful lot of
the flood.
The
flood mythology.
Mythologies.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's and I think perhaps I as we sort of go into the sort of last third, I suppose, of this discussion, can I pull us back to where I think this sits in the history of cinema and the history of these kind of portrayals in cinema, because I think it might actually inform where we actually end up.
Yeah.
I think taking a long view on this is perhaps the best way forward. If you look at the history of cinema, right back in the earliest days of cinema, films were being made on biblical subjects, and indeed big scale movies that what we now call epics. And perhaps to talk for a moment about what an epic actually is in literature and so on, just very quickly, because back in, I think it was about 1898, 1899, for example, the Méliès made a film which translates as Christ Walks Upon the Water. It was just a little short about the miracle of walking on the Dead Sea. Before the First World War, epics were being made on biblical subjects and historical subjects. And they were drawing on a tradition. I mean, the literary tradition, and I'll quote for the first time ever on Watching Brief. I'm going to quote from Aristotle.
Oh wow! Okay.
This is from On the Art of Poetry, so it's over 2,000 years old, 2,500 years old almost. And Aristotle wrote, epics should not be like ordinary histories in which one deals not with a single affair but with a single period and all that happened to one or more persons during it and all the various consequences.
Mm.
So the people talk about the epic sweep of history.
Mm-hmm.
It's about dealing with a heroic figure, an epic figure. You mentioned Beowulf just now, and it takes the trajectory of their life, their career, whatever. In Noah, we've got the Noah's trajectory from being an ordinary family man to the man who saves humanity.
Yeah.
Um,
Sorry, I'm just laughing about that bottleneck, that really bad genetic bottleneck. So go on.
But also, there's another quote from Aristotle, which I think also is relevant to the tradition that Aronofsky is drawing on here. Because Aristotle also wrote in the same, The Art of Poetry, it's clear from the aforesaid also that a poet's job is not to say what has happened, but what could happen.
Okay.
And so that there's a sort of philosophical and literary antecedents for films like Aronofsky's. When it comes to cinema, in the early days of cinema, the traditions and the visual traditions of telling these stories were the sort of epic paintings of the 19th century and the historical paintings of the 19th century. So you've got people like Alma Tadema, Richard Dadd, Gustave Doré, the famous engravings of various stories like Dante's Inferno and so on, and the Divine Comedy and historical subjects, and often they take a very literal view according to the history and archaeology of the time. So and in fact, if you take one of the first full-length, in fact, I think it's the only previous full-length version of the Noah story before Darren Aronofsky's. It was directed by a Hungarian emigre director called Michael Curtiz, who went on to direct Errol Flynn in Robin Hood, one of the greatest epic movies ever made, and also Casablanca. But he, in 1928-29, he made a film called Noah. But there, the visual references were northern Mesopotamia around 2500 BC, the milieu where the stories were being written down as the Epic of Gilgamesh and later in Genesis. And it was, but at the center of it, I say full length, it was framed with a modern story that was supposed to give relevance and to the disaster and the flood. And in fact, it was set at the end of the First World War, in the with people trapped in a sort of bunker type thing, and it's but really the whole thing is just an excuse to get to the flood and the epic action. But so the visual references were from archaeological sources. You go forward to the 1950s, you got Ben-Hur, and for example, you get the sense that Ben-Hur was an antiques collector, at least, because there's a copy of one of the alabaster jars from the tomb of Tutankhamun in Ben-Hur's house at the beginning of the movie. But these are the visual references that are being drawn on. Cecil B. DeMille, if you look at Ten Commandments, if you freeze frame any of the big sequences in Ten Commandments, and they could come from a watercolor and a Victorian edition of the Bible.
One of these giant 8-foot tall oil epics. Well, epic.
That's right. Yeah, epic painting. No, exactly that. And so, and the only other significant cinematic version of the Noah story, I think, is from an Italian-produced epic directed by John Huston, who also played Noah in the 1960s. It was called The Bible in the Beginning. And it was what they used to call a portmanteau movie. It was a movie of several different parts, which were loosely linked together. So it told the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, it told the story of Cain and Abel, and it also told the story of Noah. And there, John Huston's this sort of white-bearded, twinkly-eyed, traditional version of Noah, and the real animals are being led, 2 by 2 onto the ark. But that was almost the sort of the last fling of that kind of treatment. Flipping forward, I think by using the imagery of a computer game, by stripping away, it doesn't use the G word God once, I think.
No,
It talks about creators and things like
the
that. But
creator. Yeah.
it talks about the creator, exactly. And so what I think Aronofsky is doing exactly what those early filmmakers did when they were referencing, Alma Tadema and Gustave Doré. He's taking the visual vocabulary of the moment, which is the epic CGI massive open world computer game, and using it to tell in a 98% secular way this traditional story that's been treated in different ways since it was written down in its various forms historically, in over millennia.
Well, which is fair enough. So, as part of that sort of cinematic tradition, it makes sense. I do. I suppose in that sense, I find myself wondering, I suppose as you were, why therefore Noah? There have been. I mean, I was talking about a space sci-fi just before. There have been actually stories that are literally about that. Is it The Passenger or The Passengers was one not that long ago, where humanity is on its way somewhere, and Prometheus, its sequel, Alien Covenant, certainly has a ship full of embryos on its way to a new Earth.
Yeah, well, the trope of what's often called a generation starship has been a trope in science fiction going back to the 1950s.
Yeah, not least because the question is how do you traverse such a massive universe? Well, the answer is you probably have to live and die on the ship for a couple of generations. But I think in this instance, I find myself coming back to some of the set design, the art design questions about things like sheet metal being used for at one point actually there's actually literally corrugated steel sheets are used, or iron sheets are used by Ray Winston's bodyguard troop to sort of push forward against these massive giants that are defending the Ark just before the deluge begins. But given you have all of this, again, woven cloth, ceramics, knives, etc., in the way that they are set in this millions of years old context, I can't help but think, well, yeah, but actually, the filmmaker, Darren Aronofsky, would have known that this is essentially a Bronze Age tale. That this is in fact, one of the flaws of was it Bishop Ussher and his chronology of the history of the Earth using the biblical...
4004 BC.
Yeah,
the Earth was created in 4004 BC.
On a he got right down to an afternoon, didn't he? When he thought it happened.
Yes.
I can't remember the exact date, but one of the flaws of using the Bible to tell an absolute story of human history is that it isn't complete. It is incomplete, and so I don't know. I feel as though, and maybe this is part of the point, this film actually could have been set thousands of years from now. I think, as you were saying, in terms of a Mad Max kind of setting, and it would have been, it could have been the same story. And is that ultimately the question that we're bringing ourselves back to, in terms of just why? Is that your overarching? Were you just left with a giant question mark?
Yeah, I'm afraid I was. I mean, I recognise the craftsmanship in a lot of the movie, and the looks are striking. But you see, I mean, again, you talked about the Wrigley tin and the costumes and so on, and again, that reminded me of the way that a theatre designer often approaches sort of a Shakespearean history play, particularly in the modern world. The tendency isn't to try and be historical and dress a play in late Elizabethan, early Jacobean costume. It's to use elements of anything that seems to fit with the overall vision for the production.
Mm.
And I think, I think there's that's what's gone on here, and certainly, you know, obviously, from very early on, Aronofsky and his team decided they weren't going to do a historically based vision in any way, whether it's the language or the look, the landscapes. It's all sublimated to this particular vision of this destruction redemption cycle.
Mm. Mm.
And they've got that, and again, for whatever reason, they chose to distance it from at least some of the source material.
Mm. Well,
And
and yet, though, they also it occurred to me um,
mm,
a few moments ago. We're having to break
mm,
this conversation up, folks at home, because of Zoom call lengths. But it occurred to me in between our calls that actually there's a moment when Methuselah is shown as a younger man, the guy played by Anthony
yeah,
Hopkins, and he's wielding a great big
mm,
fiery sword. And I remembered, oh yeah,
yes,
that's the sword that supposedly Adam was given as he left the garden.
mm,
Neil Gaiman makes a lot of that in Good Omens as well, I believe. You gave him your sword, like that kind of thing. So actually, you
yeah,
say that they're distancing themselves from it, but also they're bringing in, and maybe it's partly because it's also a wonderful visual. It's a cinematic thing to bring in,
yeah,
but they're bringing in
yeah.
details that they didn't have to from the biblical context as well.
Mm.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Look, I mean, I think, I mean, in the end, yes, it's a film. It's cinematic.
Hmm.
Aronofsky's a good director.
Hmm.
He can, there is a sweep to the thing. But like I say, it's the same kind of sweep and epic action that I could get in a good computer game. I think that ultimately for me, that's what um, a, a film about effectively the end of the world and the creation of a new world ought to have been more engaging, ought to have
Hmm.
been more humane. I just thought, yeah, this is a clever artifice, but that's all it is.
Right. That's interesting. That's interesting. I think for my part, I found there was stuff to think about, and I found uh, the drama, particularly between the urge to survive and create and to look after the next generation. That plays out with you know a surprise pregnancy on board the vessel, and also as well. Probably the best piece of acting in the whole film, where Connolly's Jennifer Connolly as Noah's wife
Mm,
is basically saying, because he's come to the conclusion that he needs to murder this baby if it is a girl,
mm,
i.e., if it could bear more offspring. Um,
yeah.
she You can feel the fierceness of motherhood coming out there, and
Mm,
the strength of desire to love and to nourish and to nurture. She's, you know, tears streaming down her face. She's saying, you
mm.
will, I will never forgive you if you do this. This will never be forgotten. You'll die alone. And that I found
And
that.
in that sequence,
Hmm.
uh, Noah is the villain. You are
Yeah.
in that sequence. The way it's set up again, it's not there in Genesis. It is there in the screen. In the screenplay they've
Hmm.
created, and they've
Hmm.
created a moment when the woman confronts the hero, the male hero,
Hmm.
who is undoubtedly, for the audience, in the wrong. He's
Hmm.
about to commit an absolutely appalling act of uncalled for violence,
Yeah. Yeah.
and she, and you're rooting for her to stop him. You don't want it to happen,
No. But and
and that's
yet,
nothing to.
well, sorry, and yet, what part of the I think of the beauty of the film is that it comes down to whether or not you take from this a God-given mandate, or you take from this,
Mm,
the primacy of human intellect. It comes down to actually to a moment of his discernment. He decides and feels, actually, I love these. Spoiler alert: there were twins who were
mm,
born. I love these twins. I can't kill them.
yes,
Uh,
yeah,
I see good here, and I will. I will act accordingly. Now that also, I think, gives a beautiful context of the fact that he goes off and does get trashed. I got the suspicion, the sneaky suspicion, it didn't require too much soul searching for Russell Crowe to find that in himself. When he's naked on a beach, absolutely
Yeah,
trashed at the end of the film.
yeah,
Um, but also, I think not only is it because he feels as though perhaps he's let his mission down, he's let his god or his the creator down, but also I
mm,
got a real sense of trauma as well, that these people had been through all of this, and there is a question, I'm sure, in his mind, the character, that is Noah's mind, what for?
mm,
Was this the right thing to do? You know, should we not have just perished with the rest of humanity? It's I think if you want to meditate upon it a little bit or to reflect
mm,
upon it, there is stuff there. But is it just the fact that it's so of its time, in so much as it's part of that legacy of the Lord of the Rings and Troy and so on and so forth, that it gets in the way of the human story? And maybe that's why he went on to tell a tale like Mother, which is much smaller
yeah.
in scope.
I think, well, it certainly it comes at the end of that cycle of epic movies.
Hmm.
Now I've quoted Aristotle just now. I'm also going to quote Charlton Heston, um, who appeared in a good few epics,
Uh-huh.
and El Cid, Ben Hur, 55 Days at Peking, and
Yeah.
so on and so on and so on.
He was Moses, wasn't
Um,
he?
he was Moses, and that's the thing.
Yeah.
Yes, he was Moses in the Ten Commandments, and that was the film that made his career and
Hmm.
associated him forever with that kind of movie. Um, and and like Russell Crowe in this, yeah, he has that sort of rock hewn aspect to his acting.
Hmm.
To put it kindly, some might say. But Heston, who knew the film business, said of epic films, there's one thing you can say for definite about epics, and is that they're basically the easiest film to make, one of the easiest forms of film to make badly.
Okay.
And certainly looking at some of the movies from the 1950s now, that it's laughable. You get wooden or histrionic acting. You get unspeakable lines that mix, you know, the biblical um, King James version gravitas
Hmm.
with the most ludicrous sort of Hollywood. There's a line in the Ten Commandments when Charlton Heston as Moses, I think, is sort of a prisoner of the Egyptians, and
Hmm.
his the Egyptian princess who fancies him says something along the lines of, Moses, you mad irresistible fool, I love you, Moses, or something like that. I mean, it's just, yeah, this is the kind of stuff that, you know, we don't get that, thankfully,
Hmm.
in Noah. Um, but I think in the end as well, it's a bit po-faced.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, it's it like I said earlier on, it falls between so many stools. But personally, it didn't work for me. But then, who am I to say? I mean, it was budgeted at around sort of $160 million and made over twice that at the box office. So,
Hmm.
you know,
And yet
somebody
it
liked
and
it.
well and yet though it's only rated at I think 5.8 on IMDb. So it's not rated as a great movie either.
Absolutely, no,
Hmm.
no, absolutely not. I
Hmm.
mean, if you and apparently, again, it's reported that the producers, Paramount, were testing it. They were trying alternate cuts, allegedly over Aronofsky's objections
Hmm.
as the director, because they among the things they were concerned about was the reaction from religious audiences, and in fact, in some parts of the world, it's been banned in parts of the Middle East because it portrays one of the revered figures in Islam,
Yeah.
um, and it was the essentially the Paramount actually issued a disclaimer when the film was released, which is always a sign of confidence.
Hmm.
They said, quote, "The film is inspired by the story of Noah. Whilst artistic license has been taken, we believe this film is true to the essence, values, and integrity of the story that is the cornerstone of faith for millions of people worldwide. The biblical story of Noah can be found in the book of Genesis." In other words, this is Aronofsky's film, but you know,
We're not burning
if you want the
Bibles,
real,
folks.
if you
Yeah.
want exactly, yeah, if you want the real text, go and look at Genesis.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I feel also I feel as though that's an issue as well. I don't like it's a little bit like when the Life of Brian was released, and there's an
Mm,
infamous clip where I think a deacon, a member of the Church of England, I think, is on a panel, a late night talk show panel with John Cleese, and Cleese says something along the lines of, uh, I don't think. Was it? Come on now. If a film can destroy your faith, what sort of faith do you have to begin with? And
yeah.
I think there's something there as well. I mean, you just said that Paramount described it as being the story as being part of a cornerstone of faith.
Mm.
I I'm not sure that the Noah story actually is a good cornerstone for any faith. Actually, I think I don't mean that to be controversial, but I think there are um, far more edifying, far less uh, genocidal stories that you might want to
No,
look to. Um,
yeah,
but at the same but at the same time, it is. I say going right back to my childhood, certainly, growing up where my grandparents might give me, your first book of children's Bible tales or something. It's there. It is in that sense a cornerstone because it's something that it's one of the first stories people are often told, whether they're religious or not, in the Western world.
yeah. I mean, look, I think as well though. I mean, the other thing I can't get away from is the some of the criticism of the film in terms of its the way it portrayed the world,
Hmm.
um, and particularly the issue uh, of the lack of diversity
Hmm.
uh, in the cast, and I think again, there's a quote from the co-writer of the screenplay, Ari Handel,
Hmm.
who said in an interview, "From the beginning, we were concerned about casting the issue of race. What we realized is that this story is functioning at the level of myth, and as a mythical story, the race of the individuals doesn't matter. So why cast lots of white people? You know, that's a cop out."
Well, it's cop out, but also it's a bit of a it's problematic to think that white is default, i.e., white is
Yeah,
neutral, white is
yeah,
not racial. That's really
yeah,
interesting. That's a really interesting
yeah,
problem there. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah. So it again, you know, once you dig beneath the surface of this the CGI effect, spectacular, which is very competently directed, very competently performed in some, like Jennifer Connelly, I think it's just a powerful but moving performance in some
Mm-hmm.
respects.
Mm-hmm.
But once you dig beneath it, some quite troubling stuff, as well as some and
Mm.
emerges.
Mm. Okay. Okay. I suppose finally, would you recommend it?
Oh my goodness. I'd never say don't watch something unless it was absolutely unforgivably awful,
Mm-hmm.
in every sense of that kind of word. Because I think there's always something to learn. I'm not making an analogy at all, but there are justifiable reasons for watching, Lenny Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will,
Mm.
although it represents an absolutely appalling ideology and mythologizing that appalling ideology. Um, in this case, obviously, we're talking about a mainstream Hollywood movie. Um, it fills a couple of hours. Look, put it this way. Um, I wouldn't have watched it if you hadn't suggested it for the Unstratified Entertainment.
Mm.
And having seen it, I think it throws up some. really interesting issues. It sits very in an interesting place in the history of Hollywood and the Hollywood epic, and that's something I've been interested in since I was a kid.
Hmm.
Um, but would I would I feel I'd missed out if I hadn't actually watched it? I didn't watch it at the time, and I probably wouldn't have gone out of my way to watch it if you hadn't suggested it.
Okay, yeah, that's fair enough. I suppose I agree. It fills time. It's a fill space kind of film, but also as well, I think on the level of what it achieves, as opposed to judging it based on what it isn't. I would say there are some interesting questions to be found there, particularly if you do a little mental exercise of role play in that sense. What would you do in this scenario? How would you feel? Uh, how far would you go? But also, just for a moment, with an archaeological hat on, I think the configuration of artifacts, material culture, clothing, weight life paths, for example, being essentially fully herbivore and or downright vegan in terms of ways of living, um, is a fascinating reflection of how people think people in the past lived, as opposed to actually how people in the past lived. And so in that sense, I think that there are interesting uh, things to contemplate there. Why do people think that? Well, why is it then? Also, I've come across this in other films as well. For example, 10,000 BC. Why is it that people can't conceive of prehistory without some of these modern trappings like woven cloth, metal tools, so on and so forth?
I'll tell you what I can't conceive of at the moment. It's why the chuck Noah took those two dogs into the ark.
Yeah, folks, I don't know how successful we're going to be with the edit, but yeah, Loki's being an excitable pup, isn't he, in House Brockman at the moment? Bless him.
He has been a little bit busy this afternoon. Yeah, I do apologise if it intrudes on the
No problem
on
at
the
all.
soundtrack.
Well, let's leave it there. I imagine
Loki.
I think Loki probably needs maybe a bit of a walk, or at the very least needs some attention. So,
Yeah.
thank you guys for
He was, he
watching.
was, pro- he was probably annoyed at the fact that I was dissing the Marvel universe earlier on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. You shouldn't mock his source material.
yes.
Thank you guys for watching at home. Please do comment below if you have any interesting thoughts that arise from this conversation. Keep the comments respectful. I just want to just underscore: I'm not uh, I'm not mocking religious faith. At times when
Yeah.
I've made comments on this story, I think I'm interested in or finding humour in the retelling of these stories. But the you know people are free to believe what they want to believe. So please don't mock
Indeed.
that either in the comments. And finally, is it going to be the 300 in our next episode?
Oh God, if we're talking about CGI fest and the history of the epic, we probably ought to do 300 or something. Whether having just done
Noah.
Noah, we should go
Yeah.
directly to 300. I just feel something a little more gentle, a little less spiky, perhaps a little more nourishing. But what
Okay.
that is, I really don't know right at the moment.
Okay. Well, we'll see. See you guys soon. Until then, take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.